Yeah, it needs to be straight.
Straight.
Coming right down the front so I can hear it.
What was that, John?
Hey? Coming right down the front so I can hear it. Yeah, that's it.
You can sit here.
Oh yeah, sit there.
You remember the month?
Right, welcome everyone. I'm going to begin by getting undressed.
Hey.
It's a great honour to be here or to be asked. I don't know if it's an honour to be here because you have to put up with me. I tend to walk around when I talk, so I'm going to annoy you all by doing this and then. But anyway, I have recently completed, as you heard from Michael, a PhD. And 3 months ago, I had to endure my VIVA, which is an oral exam. And as traumatic as that was, not having an academic background, not even graduating school, was the first time learning how to learn at my age was one thing. But I am more nervous actually speaking to my colleagues about this subject here today because I'm surrounded by esteemed experts in what you do. So, look at that, steady as a rock. And blazing saddles, that's my shooting hand. So, right, we're going to get into it. When Michael asked me to do or have a discussion about restoring or repairing historical keyboard instruments, I thought, well, that's a bit of a problem or a bit of a challenge because do we have a clavichord here or a harpsichord here? All these things that we could have present to talk about my experience of maintaining historical keyboard instruments is all not doable. So I decided to approach today in a more academic level. If I get too academic at any time, again, feel free to throw a shoe. No one threw a shoe yesterday to me, so I'm looking forward to a shoe. But I'm going to approach this on a more academic level. That is, what not to do when you're confronted with restoring or repairing or maintaining what you might see or know as a historical keyboard instrument. In the 1960s and 70s, we saw a huge boom we now call the early music revival. The early music revival essentially wanted to rebirth and the use of historical keyboard instruments that had more or less fallen away because of fashion and these things. So by the 60s and 70s, worldwide, this movement, the early music revival movement, demanded that we could actually hear authentic instruments played using repertoire authentic to their period. In other words, we don't want to hear Haydn on that anymore. We want to hear Haydn on an instrument similar to what he would have composed it on. It's not that this is better or the other one was better, it's just very different. Harpsichord's an obvious one. For a long, long time, the harpsichord reigned supreme. It wasn't until Hubbard came along and wrote his book about the 300 years of all the knowledge we lost when harpsichords died away because of this. So the early music revival created an interest in the player and the audience wanting to hear authentic historical instruments. This created a significant problem. And it's very easy to generalise, and which is also very dangerous to do. And so what I'm going to do is present, even though it is generalised, I'm not going to be dogmatic that you must approach every single instrument that you are confronted with in the same way. Each instrument must be approached with a different set of information. So I'm not going to be dogmatic to say this is what you do all the time. Nor am I going to say something as silly as this, that we modern piano tuners are responsible for the demise of a lot of very important historical keyboard instruments. Now, I'm sure that there's no one in this room who's willing to put their hand up or acknowledge or be participant of destroying information on a historical keyboard instrument. I have. I look back at instruments that I have maintained and I hang my head in shame. Now that I have learnt what I've learnt and continuing to learn what I learn, I would do things now rather differently. So, using that experience, I thought what I'd like to do is approach this in a way of when you have an instrument as a modern piano technician that you're faced with either restoring, repairing, or maintaining as to what not to do. What led me to this is in 2018. Sorry, bit of a plug for tomorrow. So tomorrow I'm doing a talk about what my PhD was all about. That is the restorative conservation of what may be Australia's first fleet piano. And this is the piano that you can see in Bathampton Chapel in UK, which is the burial site of Captain Arthur Phillip, and the entire church is dedicated to those who came out on the first fleet. Not necessarily everyone who wanted to be downstairs on the fleet either is all recognised in it for either being, you know, a criminal because they stole something or just being Irish. So, what led me to my journey in historical keyboard instruments as a modern piano technician, where I have to acknowledge the two gentlemen in the front row here who are my masters. So they've been on my journey. In fact, John Flanagan, who's introduced me to this craft when I was only a boy of 10. It's remarkable that this incredible gentleman is still here today. And we thank him, I thank him for everything that he's done to inspire me. Sitting next to him is John Cross, who is my master and teacher for all the time that I was a trainee. So, what led me into this pathway was in 2017 I received a Churchill Fellowship, and that was travelling around UK and Europe to look at and research or investigate the care and restoration of early keyboard instruments. The side hustle of this was really who's looking after them into the future. Again, this narrative has happened already in the convention and it will continue to happen, that is future training of technicians. So this gave me an opportunity to literally travel in very opulent places such as I got to spend time with the technician David Winston, who has the warrant to look after the Queen's piano. Here you see Queen Victoria's gold-plated air art, which is a remarkable instrument. The church will literally open these doors to be not only present with the people who are looking after them, but also, you know, have the honour of seeing and playing these instruments. On a side note, on the bottom left-hand side, bottom right-hand side, you'll see Royal Albert Hall, and the same piano that you see sitting behind the late Queen is Queen Victoria's gold-plated air art, or gold leaf air art. In beginning of 2019, again as a side comment about training, Mr. David Winston, pictured here, who's the curator and the only person allowed to touch this instrument, developed a sore arm. Mr. Hoff was, I forget his name, it was asked to play for a special celebration at my brain just stopped. Oh, there it is, at Royal Albert Hall. They flew me over to be the assistant technician because Mr. David Winston had hurt his shoulder, and there wasn't another single experienced technician in UK or Europe that they trusted to maintain the instrument. Now, it's all very well that a long-haired colonial gets to, you know, have this privilege and honour, but also slightly silly, because surely there should be someone in UK or Europe who could be able to do this work, so that the fight continues, the battle still continues. My Churchill took me to the motherlands, if you like, of piano invention. So it took me from places like Florence, Vienna, and London, etc., all the way through 28 different cities. Throughout this journey of looking at historical instruments, I noticed a continuing theme, and that is most of them, in fact all but one, were unplayable. Oh, sorry, all but two were unplayable. In a state, if you like, it's a rotten word to use, but in a state of ruin. So here we have Cristofori's instrument that he invented, that we are all here today because of what this man did. You notice in the bottom right-hand photograph, here is the original, and here is a replica. This is a photograph of the very famous collection in St Celia's Museum or University in Edinburgh. This is an example of one of the finest harpsichord builders that ever lived, Rookers. It's also an example of what happens when fashion dictates change. So this instrument, in fact the instruments that you see in the foreground and in fact behind, were owned by very eminent people. For example, the one in the front was owned by Queen Charlotte. But as fashions changed, she wanted her harpsichord to be a piano. So she commissioned someone to rebirth it as a piano. She passes away, and then they realise, oops, it was never meant to be a piano. It doesn't function properly as a piano. Let's remove that mechanism and convert it back to a harpsichord. By the time this is now bastardised 3 times, the instrument is now completely non-functional. All it is now is a beautiful artefact, but it's also an artefact of information. There's Rubens painted all over the inside of the lid. But this is an example of heavy-handed style of conservation or restoration, if you like, of historical instruments as a knee-jerk, as an example knee-jerk to the early music revival in the 60s and 70s. This is also a Rookers harpsichord. This is a priceless 1640 Rookers harpsichord. It's been in the same family since the beginning in Germany. And it's now stored and housed, I should say, in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. So the man looking at the artwork on the case is in fact the generational owner of this instrument. It's survived. So it survived a lot of things, world wars, recessions, depressions. Somehow it survived. And there's a reason why it survived. It's because it's been conserved appropriately. And people like me haven't been commissioned to come along and turn it into a piano or something like that. I've never done that, by the way. But now we have an opportunity to hear what Gustav Leonhard, possibly one of the world's greatest harpsichord players, regarded as the greatest harpsichord in the world, this particular instrument, which he recorded on many, many times. This instrument almost came to Perth, Western Australia, where I look after some of the instruments at the West Australian Academy of Performing Arts. Why? Because this man who now still owns it was about to lose it due to some family issues. They're a very wealthy family, and it was about to be put on eBay, and we never know what would happen to it. So instead it got housed away in a fireproof safe in Switzerland and stored appropriately for a long time. And when a family member was no longer around to create an argument, he then donated it to the Rijksmuseum on 1 or 2 conditions, that it's looked after appropriately, maintained appropriately, and played appropriately. So when an instrument becomes not just an artefact, but when it's still functional like this piano, it does 2 things. It tells us a story of its journey and its life in the past. So in this case, the Rijksmuseum's art laboratory is looking which of the paintings or which figures in the painting is actually genuine Rubens. Rookers actually in Antwerp had a workshop right next door to Rubens, so it was very convenient for him to wheel out his harpsichord and wheel it into this bloke next door who can muck around with a bit of paint. Rubens, muck around with a bit of paint. Rubens, see, my brain is just kind of unswitched from PhD. Muck around with a bit of paint. Anyway, Rubens had a workshop, and in that workshop he employed people to obviously paint things as well. So by maintaining and conserving instruments, we can actually use them as storybooks of the past. We can't do that if they've been destroyed, or altered, or bastardised, or destroyed in some way. Who's responsible for that? Well, is it the owner? Is it the museum? Or is it the technician who's asked to respond to an intervention? For example, this is the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. Who's been to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna? One by one you have to save your shekels and go to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, the world's best and most significant collection of musical instruments in the world. I've been there numerous occasions as a tourist, as a Churchill Fellow, and then as a PhD researcher. Before my Churchill, Mr. Alphonse, or Dr. Alphonse Huber, who was the technician who maintains this collection until he retired last year, wouldn't even answer my email, let alone a phone call, let alone even a knock on his door. I'm just a long-haired colonial, it seems. So the Churchill not only opened the doors for me to get into Buckingham Palace, it opened the doors to get into the mind and experiences of Dr. Alphonse Huber. As a side note, this collection that exists in the Habsburg's Palace in the centre of Vienna, which is one of the most prestigious areas of historical Vienna. I happened to be there by chance on the very day that the Austrian government announced that they're going to disband the entire collection of musical instruments that's been gathered for a long time, due to overwhelming costs of maintaining them. Instead, for economic reasons, the Austrian government decided that they were going to convert the Habsburg's Palace into separate apartments, and this entire collection would be disbanded or lost. I happened also to be there on the very day, many years later, where the Austrian government announced we are not going to disband the collection. We're going to, in fact, keep the collection. Two reasons. First reason, breaking up the Habsburg's Palace and turning it into apartments, although was going to make a lot of money, what do you do with that apartment? Meaning the apartment that had the balcony that has a photograph of Hitler standing there looking at his troops walk past him. And the issue wasn't so much that the Austrian government found that they couldn't sell that apartment. It was unfortunately the interest in people who wanted to buy the apartment. The second thing that saved this collection was in fact Dr. Alphonse Huber. So when he went to the government as a piano tuner, as we all have continued to fight as an association, for recognition of our skills and our craft and the future of our skills and craft. Dr. Alphonse Huber was, at the time, not doctor, but he was told by the government one of the reasons why we have to disband the collection is because it's just so damn expensive to maintain it. Heating, air conditioning, all these things that we all know that we have to maintain for the environment that the instruments are in. So what does he do? He falls on his sword and decides at the end of his career to do a PhD. His PhD was an environmental PhD, and he found that the original architects of this building were very clever. Indeed, royalty likes their comfort. And so there was a shaft that went through the entire building that has been since, or was since sealed up. But this shaft wasn't like a lazy Susan, or wasn't necessarily to go down to a basement or a well. It was actually a shaft to create controlled environment by opening flaps and closing flaps and things like this. So Dr. Alphonse Huber researched to save this collection was find a way to maintain the collection without spending huge amounts of money on electricity and resource to cool or heat the venue. Simply by re-establishing the shaft that went through the palace, triple glazing the windows and putting an airlock in. And he saved the world's most significant collection because of these things. So, remarkable man. When I did meet him in this collection though, he said to me, if you're chasing, like musicians want to chase since the early music revival, original sound, you're going to be terribly disappointed. Original sound is lost. hundreds of years of lack of maintenance or pressure or tension or environment means that that instrument's not going to sound anything the same as it did if it was built in the 1600s. So if you're chasing original sound, you have to use your imagination. Or you can approach it on an academic level. So the instrument you see in the foreground here was the last instrument owned and used by Liszt. It was in America. And like a lot of erards, it has a weak plank. And the plank is split, so the tuning pins are now leaning forward, the rest pins are leaning forward, and it won't maintain its tuning. It was going to be completely restored until it was rescued in secret by Dr. Alphonse Huber. It will never be restored. As frustrating as it is for current musicians and scholars to want to hear or play and hear the instrument that Liszt owned, we have to not do this. Why? Well, we can appease this current generation by restoring the instrument to a playable state, but lose information about the instrument. But for hundreds of years of future research, a researcher can come along and look at this instrument, look at the hammer coverings, look at the timbre, and look at all sorts of things that you can possibly no longer access, and develop a knowledge base and a library of just what Liszt's piano was. If you restore it, all that information is lost. Another example, how do I get rid of that? Sorry.
That got rid of it.
It did get rid of it. It gives me a chance to pause.
Shift F5.
Yeah.
Did you say Shift F5? Didn't work.
Didn't work?
It should. Oh, it's a Mac, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Mac. Oh,
Go up to slideshow.
It'll be one of the other Mac buttons in that file.
yeah. It will behave itself soon. Anyway, we can still carry on this way. Here we have another example of what happens when we restore a piano. So this instrument, no, actually I need this to be full.
Go view.
Yeah, it's frozen. It's okay. There you PhD as a piano technician only demonstrated one thing to me. Technology promises the world and delivers nothing but frustration. So here we have, in the Hornblower Museum in Bath, UK, an instrument made by Schultz around 1795. It's only one of 4 left in the world that was favoured by Haydn. And it was fully restored by the amazing restorer in Holland, Edward Funk. Original sound is now lost. So, the way I wanted to approach tonight, or this afternoon, is should a piano or a keyboard instrument, so I'm going to obviously, out of sheer habit, convert from piano to keyboard instrument, be it a harpsichord that you might be faced with fixing, or a clavichord, or a piano, historic piano. Should it be returned to a playable state, in other words, functional, or should it be left as an artifact of stored information? This has recently appeared on Facebook on one of the technicians' forums. So here we have again an instrument made by Walter, and it's housed at the Bechstein Foundation collection in Berlin. And I had the fortune of seeing this very instrument and hearing this very instrument just last month. But it's caused a complete storm in the restoration world. And again, I'm not taking sides here. I'm not going to be that pragmatic or dogmatic to say that this is right or a wrong thing to do, but simply just to place the question in your mind now, and the response from the international community as to its recent restoration by, again, the amazing Dutch restorer Edward Bonk. So this is by no means, what I'm about to read, a reflection of what we think of Mr. Bonk and his work. It's the philosophy of whether a piano should be restored or not. So this is out in the public domain on Facebook. And the response to this restoration, recent restoration by Edward Bonk, created fire from the also eminent restorer Christopher Clark from France. And I'm going to quote as closely I can, because it's been translated, his response. Christopher Clark says this: "To have restored this unique example of Walter's early work to a plain condition is, I'm sorry to say, a huge, disappointing act of institutional hubris and cultural vandalism." These are nasty words. These are really, inciting words. "It has depraved future generations of the opportunity of studying the great master's work that has lain untouched until it entered the present restorer's workshop 2 years ago." Gee, I'm glad I wasn't the person asked to restore them. "Any restoration by its nature reflects," Christopher Clark carries on, by saying, "reflects the state of knowledge and capacities of the restorer, which guide the choices they make, that they impose on the object, one which invariably transforms and alters it, replacing or even simply disturbing material that was once put in place by the original maker, removes evidence that today might be seen trivial, but which might have proved capital to the future researchers. Even careful documentation, because it's based on our current knowledge, can miss a lot. Every other known Walter piano over the last 2.5 centuries since it was made has undergone several of these transformations. Some of them by Walter himself, most of them by technicians with wildly differing agendas and skills. It ought to be, I can't say his words so, but it ought to be in today a completely unadulterated Walter instrument. And in principle, be carefully conserved, should have been carefully conserved as a precious and irreplaceable object of study." You can see where the argument's going. Lastly, he concludes by stating this: "A study of the art facsimile or facsimiles could and should be made." In other words, replicating the instrument. "Ideally by different makers." In other words, different philosophies and approach. There's Paul McNulty, there's Chris Marner. "To explore its qualities as a working instrument, the choices made in doing so would have had no impact on the original. For many years, the more responsible public collections have made this choice. In some measure to atone for the destruction in the name of restoration that have previously gone on within their walls, and which have seriously frustrated subsequent research. As the discoverer of this unique instrument," in other words, Christopher Clark discovered this instrument. You can see why he's a little bit, "As a researcher, restorer and builder of some experience, I have made a reasoned and personal plea both to Bechstein, the collection owners of this instrument, and to the restorer, that is Edward Bonk, to adopt this course. But, alas, in vain. It's now too late. It is now done, and the instrument has now been irreversibly changed." What do the experts say? And I must say, I'm not an expert in this area. We're in fact just infants in this area. Remember, the early music revival is only the 1960s and the 1970s. So we're still knee-jerking as a response to the demand of the owner or the museum or the player to actually make an instrument playable. But there are some experts in this field now, such as the author and conservator Robert Barclay. And if you need some bedtime reading, this is an ideal book to latch onto. It's not very expensive. It was based on Robert Barclay's own dissertation on the research he did on historical instruments, and it's called The Preservation and Use of Historical Music Instruments from Display Case and Concert Hall. I'm going to read out his preface because this is the area of his expertise, not mine. I'm going to honour him by just reading the first paragraph of his preface. Since the beginning of the early music revival over a century ago, there has been a demand to bring old and often derelict musical instruments back into working condition. Because this action requires craft intervention, it has the potential to compromise historical and technical detail of the instrument that may have been of interest to present and future organologists. Organologist means the research of musical instruments, instrument makers and other scholars. He goes on to say this: any restoration, refurbishment or repair incurs loss of original detail. This is inevitable. A tension has therefore arisen between those who favour restoration of instruments to a playable state and those who argue for non-functional preservation. Restoration and preservation have become polarised to the point where in some disciplines there is hardly any dialogue between the practitioners. And as I've just read out what Christopher Clark said, you can see when there is dialogue, it's pretty heavy going. Having encountered this polarity repeatedly during consultations on often intricate cases of historical instruments before, during and after intervention, I felt that the insights that I gained might help overcome what may appear to be an impasse. So it was out of my churchill research, and it was out of my organological research. Again, that was my PhD was in two parts: organology, and that is the research of what you'll hear tomorrow, that is what could be the first fleet piano as an instrument. And the second part of my PhD was pedagogy, in other words, training future tuners to look after or tune a historical instrument. So a question that we need to ask, which is a bit awkward in the context of us sitting in the room that know just about every definition of a modern piano or a part or a component like the back of our hand. And we can get a little bit confused on terms or definitions. So again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but we are going to approach this in a way that how can we place an argument how to care for an instrument that one day you might be faced with as a modern piano tuner, and the client might want you to repair, restore, or possibly even alter. And if you can be well informed and consider patiently your response, hopefully you won't find yourself on the end of someone like Christopher Clark having a go at you in a public forum for doing things that are deemed, let's just say, inappropriate. So most of my research was inspired by the people that I met on my churchill travels, including Dr. Alphonse Huber and two particular gentlemen. So my philosophy was based on the work of Robert Barclay that looked at things like what it means to be a historical instrument. What does it mean to be valued? Is it important? Do we actually want to value heritage? Do we want to value cultural heritage? The other person, as a piano technician, because he also is a piano technician, and I'm sure a lot of you in the room know of him quite well, is the esteemed author, piano technician and conservator John Watson. And he's written, and you can download them yourselves, the PTG in America has a very good library of documents and articles that's written by people such as John Watson, and this is, you can access yourself. In 2014, in his article, Some Proposed Principles of Piano Conservation, he says, pianos are attributed with an extraordinary aesthetic, artistic and documentary, historic, scientific or social significance, which are cultural heritage and constitute a material patrimony to be passed on to future generations. Regardless of their age, it is the nature of such instruments to be both historic and artistic each. Now he's opening a dilemma now, because he's now saying you can do both. You can actually keep and preserve a historical keyboard instrument and make it playable, make it functioning. But it's going to come at a cost. But what needs to be happening first is the consideration of the piano technician in front of this instrument. Each part of this dual nature places conditions on our right to enjoy the heritage and our obligation to preserve it for the future. Again, the previous slides I showed you gave you examples of instruments that had been either bastardised or appropriately prepared or restored at cost. Watson goes on to say, as a cultural resource, historic pianos are invaluable, endangered and non-renewable. These proposed principles of piano conservation recommend a preservation-minded approach to care and restoration that saves not only utilitarian aesthetic qualities, but also the historical narrative encoded within the piano's physical substance. He's now talking to us, the piano tuner, or the technician. Forming the basis of this document are broadly accepted principles of historic preservation, as articulated in the Principles, International Charters and Conventions. These are people who run museums and things like that. The guidelines are provided for the use by technicians, restorers, owners, and all with responsibility for the stewardship of historical instruments. And I think we need to really emphasise what Watson's saying here. If you are placed as a technician, either as to be commissioned to work on an instrument or you own an instrument, you're in fact a steward of this instrument. You're a cultural steward of that information. This instrument has a good chance. I've got 11 at home, and I don't own any of them. I'm simply just a steward of these instruments. So here's the Bechstein that was accompanying Dame Melly Melba. Just about every piano accompanied Dame Melba. Anyway, here's the piano that was gifted to UWA by the late Sir Frank Callaway. On and on it goes. I'm only a steward of these instruments. They will all outlive me, providing I do the responsible thing. So he's talking to us and our responses when that client asks you to do something to what could be an important, valuable historical instrument. The document should be considered in its entirety, he says, as many of the articles are also interdependent. In other words, we can't be dogmatic about it. John Watson, and again, a name probably familiar to you all, is a guy called Ken Sheet from the APG in America. And they both co-joined an article called Addition, Subtraction, Deception and History. Again, you can download this on the site, the PTG site. The Restorative Conservation of Historic Pianos. Piano Technicians Guild Association or Foundation. And he goes on to state this: the dual nature of historic pianos as musical instruments and historical documents presents within a paradox. The more thorough its restoration, the more a piano loses its authenticity and information-bearing evidence of its historical story. So, first question I'm sure you're already asking, if I can remember what it was. That's right. What constitutes a historical instrument? Am I only talking about pianos built by rookers in the 1600s? No. If we want to get pedantic about it, that was made later than yesterday. It's now historical, if we think of it this way. Yes, it's a modern piano, but it one day will be noted as historical. It already is history because it's already happened. So whatever happens to this piano tomorrow by a technician, is he here? Good, we can bag him. Whatever Julian, is it a Yamaha? Yeah. Whatever Julian does to this instrument will leave a historical information into the future. And we know that he will do the right thing because he has now all of us to be accountable to. But we need to change our mindset as piano technicians, that we think this is just this time, and our responses to restoring an instrument is just seen as this time, that is contemporary. But indeed, we will be, as I will be, judged by the work we decide to do by future technicians, whether we like it or not. So, there's a couple of hurdles we need to get through. That is, what constitutes, for academic purposes of this discussion, a modern piano. We could argue, as modern piano technician, what modern means. But the experts claim that a modern piano is a type of acoustic whose essential design principles were established during the late 1880s, whose essential design principles have not only remained fundamentally unchanged since, but also form the basis of contemporary acoustic hybrid pianos, which are now commonly encountered in conservatoria, concert halls and home. So by the term modern piano, anything built after 1880, which means, counter to that, if it's a historical piano, we're talking about an instrument, or I'm talking about, I should say, an instrument built prior 1880. The next question we're faced with is, who's making these decisions when we have to respond to a restoration? So in this slide that was done for me, apparently that's me. Really?
What, the one on the left?
Fitting image.
It's been a long time since I used a chin fork. Or wore a tie. But anyway, here we have an example of an English square piano. And what Barclay offers in his dissertation, in his book, is this argument since the post-early music revival of who's making the decisions to restore instruments. On the left-hand side, it could be the conservator, that is the museum, or the art gallery, or a collection boss. It could also be the person with a piece of music in his hand, obviously being the musician. It's his instrument. I want this piano to be playable. And there's me standing there, I'm happy to take your money to restore the piano, because I'm a impoverished student now, without much thought. But again, we're not talking about just historical instruments built before 1880. It could also be this piano. So it's exactly the same type of conversation that takes place when you go to your client's house and I want the voice of the instrument to sound like a Kawai. Or I want the touch of the instrument to be more like a Petrov. And yet what's in front of you is a Yamaha or Steinway. So what do you respond with? Well, it's a Yamaha. If you want a Petrov touch, go out and buy a Petrov. If you want a Wertheim sound, you go out and buy a Wertheim. But the argument still exists in all our worlds, that sometimes the client or the player doesn't necessarily know the right question to ask us to respond to as piano technicians. A case study, quickly. So this book that was published some time ago identifies the 5 remaining Zumper square pianos. Zumper, very famous man, one of possibly up to 12 German organ Cittern builder. Cittern is a type of English guitar. Cabinet makers that all escaped or tried to leave the Saxon area because of war in Germany. Because London was seen in the late 18th century as an economic powerhouse. You know, England ruled the waves. They were able to maintain and get as much materials that they want by pillaging most of the places they went to, but let's not get into that. There's only Zumper recognised that you had, to this point, essentially only one type of piano in production, and that's what we now call a Viennese concert piano, like the Walters that you saw before on the screen. The people who owned these instruments could only own them if they could afford to buy the damn things, or more importantly, have the actual space to actually store the thing. So it's aristocracy, it's royalty. Haydn was commissioned, Beethoven was commissioned. These people in this era of time were commissioned to compose on instruments that they themselves possibly couldn't even afford to buy. Zumper comes along and realised there's a gap in a market. He was a genius. And he invented what we now know as the domestic piano. This English square piano went on to be now what we now know as the upright piano. So London was the birthplace of the consequence, now our careers. Zumper invented an elegant, simple, easy to create, easy to move, and easy to maintain English square piano. Meaning, it's not square, it's rectangular, but it fits square in a corner, and it takes up less space than a winged-shaped grand piano, as harpsichords and early pianos were. They're incredibly simple. And as I said, as England ruled the waves, England took them everywhere they went. So they went to the Antipodes. So they went to Americas, they went to India, and they came to Australia. And we'll find out tomorrow whether the piano that I researched was indeed the piano that came to Australia on board the flagship, the Sirius, on the First Fleet. But they travelled the world. There was no such thing as a professional piano tuner in the late 18th century. We didn't exist as a craft. It was the owner who actually looked after the instrument. In fact, there's writings from Captain Williamson, who said to his free settlers who were going over to India, as they left Portsmouth, it was like a travel guide, you got a Verdi Mecum, that he handed all out to his passengers. In other words, this is what's going to go on when you get to India. This is the language. This is the currency. This is the culture. By the way, if you got yourselves an English square piano on board, you've got 3 months to learn how to tune it. On a sailing ship, a very cramped sailing ship, a very noisy. So we complain about someone making vacuum cleaner noise. Imagine this. And the reason why you have to learn how to do it yourself, he said to this woman who owned one, is because when you get to Calcutta, your closest professional piano technician is in the factory of Broadwood in London. Imagine his cost. So we don't know the results of this woman. In other words, how successful her tuning was. But she had to do it. Here's an example of what is now well known to us all. In fact, the two gentlemen and Gary Bailey know this very well because we all grew up in the 70s doing exactly this, naughty business, and that is modernising pianos. Here we have identified as one of the world's last surviving Zumpers. We don't know how many were made, but we know there was thousands. There's only 5 left. As quickly as the English square piano became fashionable, Queen Charlotte fell in love with it because all of a sudden it was a domestic instrument that anyone can own and play. Any Jane Austen book gives you an idea of that type of culture that surrounded this very instrument. Bach's youngest son was in England and immediately identified as a composer. I don't have to compose like the old man did on a harpsichord, for a harpsichord. I can actually compose simple domestic pieces for the simple domestic owner. Remember, the woman of the time, the late 18th century, needed, if they wanted an ideal partner, husband at the time, to be capable of playing a musical instrument of significant quality. So C.P.E. Bach and his good friend Queen Charlotte made this instrument very popular. In fact, if this was made next week, it would have Princess Kate lying over it in Vogue with, I don't know, a contemporary artist at the time, a composer, writing something for it. This instrument is housed in the collection at WAPA, West Australian Academy of Performing Arts, as part of the Stuart Simons collection, who was in Sydney, who before him, Bill Bradshaw, collected 140 rare and important historical keyboard instruments that they gathered around Australia. And this forms one of them. Frustratingly, it was never cared for very well by Mr. Simons. In fact, when Professor Geoffrey Lancaster saw it in his farm, you can't quite see it. On the top of the case is a stain on the cabinet where a possum decided to expire and then decay. And I'll tell you what, the instrument sits in the historic keyboard collection at WAPA, and when you open it, boy does it stink. So it's a very important instrument. It's one of only 5 left in the world of the man who invented the English square piano, or what we now know as the domestic piano. At some stage, we think, this was built originally, we think, is sometime, because all information's gone. It's been bastardised, it's been modernised. So we think it was built in London in 1766 or 1767. And it was then modernised in the 1820s. So not that long after, in the 1820s and the 1830s, by a man called Mr. Botwright. We know nothing about a man called Mr. Botwright, but let's put it in contemporary words. It's come to the store that these 3 gentlemen and myself worked at, Snaiden's, to be modernised, and that's exactly what he did. So you'll notice the corners are no longer square. They've been modernised to look more contemporary, because immediately, by the 1820s, this would have been not only a redundant instrument as the upright came to be, but also incredibly difficult to tune for the owner. As it turns out, they're not that easy. And boring. And as fashion always changed, we don't want anything that looks old and boring. We want to show off to our friends that we've got something contemporary. So it was modernised. He went one step arrogantly further, the man who modernised, and not only took the name board off the piano, in other words, Zumpa, and replaced it with his own name. So you can see the decisions made by piano builders or piano restorers can actually borderline the arrogance. This is inside, and it's now a complete mess. It's completely unfunctional. As you can see, there's no strings. It stinks like you wouldn't believe. But it's a very, very valuable instrument of a document of information. So what the next question might be, for example, what constitutes information? Is it the lost, as Alphonse Suber said, the lost information of material that's gone, the sound is now gone, but what we now have is a library of information. We may not agree with what Mr. Botwright did, but it's now part of the historical fabric of the instrument and the story of the instrument. We don't like the idea or the fact that, Mr. Stuart Simons allowed a possum to die on the top of the instrument without even taking it off. But it's now part of the fabric of the instrument. It's part of this story. And the story goes on long beyond me. John Watson again has responded to this dilemma. There's only 5 instruments left in the world. None of them are workable. What do they sound like? We don't know. But what John Watson did was replicate one. So we can at least have an imagination of what the original Zumpa would have sounded like. Here's another English square piano, also in the collection at WAPA. This doesn't get context, but it's a child's piano or a travelling piano. It's very, very small. About that wide, about that deep, and the depth will break this out. Even the keyboard compass is different, and the stickmaster, in other words, the distance of an octave is different for a child's hand. Or it's a travelling piano. In other words, something you can bung in the back of your cart or your carriage as you're going by horse from one place to another and practice on. That was very common to do. Now this is important because it's the only type of its kind left in the world, but it's not original. It's been restored. By who? Well, here on the East Coast. This instrument was restored by the owner of the time, Bill Bradshaw, who was Sydney's probably most notable antiques dealer of the time. Paul Keating observed that Bill Bradshaw is probably regarded as the most respected antique dealer in Australia. So here we have on key number 1 the markings that these gentlemen told me when I was a trainee never to do, that you don't professionally vandalise the instrument by putting your name on it. I'm very grateful that these men put their name on it, because I can now tell you the story, that in only the year 2000, March, this was restored. So it's very contemporary. A cabinet maker in Sydney called Edwin Volk was commissioned to make the dampers. So as you can see, they're mahogany, and they have baleen spring, which was common at the time to keep the damper down on the string. Baleen being part of a mouth of a whale. This has been restored, but it's been restored sensitively. It's been done in such a way that, yes, we've lost information, but as Watson goes on to say, the paradox between wanting to keep something original in its original state, whatever original means, like this one here, or in this case, it's been done. By the way, what time am I supposed to finish up?
4:29.
4:29? I've still got half an hour, right. Hands up who's bored. I've dealt with this nonsense for 4 years of my life, and I've got to say it's somewhat triggering. I thought after my PhD I can walk away from this and get on with life. But as it is, no. I'm talking to my colleagues and experts about what not to do so you don't get on Facebook to be, condemned for doing something silly. If my 4 years of research has done nothing, this is what I wish to do. And that is pass on how to consider the question for how to restore, maintain, or even repair a historical instrument. In other words, do you keep it silent as an information resource, a library of information resource, or do you turn it into functional sound? Or is there a third or fourth option? So indeed, we're going to now quickly discuss these 4 options. The first thing, and I'm not going to read my notes because it goes way too long and it bores me because, as I said, I wrote them. And it's lifted directly out of my thesis. It was nauseating to read it now. But I'm just going to open with what I can cite myself now. I'm going to open with what Dr. Tunzi said, what Dr. Tunzi says about what he thinks that preservation means. Essentially, preservation means doing nothing. Absolutely nothing. Just leave it exactly as it is. We can preserve this book by doing nothing. Not touching it, not doing anything. The idea that an artefact should be regarded and treated solely as an untouched, preserved object has its origins, at least in the English-speaking world, in the writings of the English polymath John Ruskin, who was between 1819 and 1900, who in 1849 raged this: "We have no right whatsoever to touch the artefacts of past times." Shortly thereafter, there was a memorandum, I can't even say the word, let alone write it, presented to a meeting of the Society of Antiquities in London in 1855, stating that a monument destroyed, monument being building or in this case a piano, a monument destroyed, a monument restored is frequently a monument destroyed. So one option is to do nothing. If you do nothing, nothing happens, we think. But people like Grant O'Brien, the famous harpsichord maker in England, states that ideally instruments should be left and remained untouched in order to prevent the loss of information. Again, Watson goes on to say that historical instruments, by keeping them in their preserved state, encapsulates the association of reality that as a cultural resource, historical pianos are invaluable, endangered and non-renewable, as I stated before. So the dilemma we have is, do we do nothing? Doesn't appease the client. Doesn't put money in the bank either. So I've got pages of arguments from experts as to why you should never, ever, in any way touch, restore, or even repair a historical keyboard instrument. But I think I've made my point. I won't go any further than what these people say. Conservation. Now we get confused because actually it's a different thing. To conserve something means procedures that slow down the process of degradation that naturally takes place over time to ensure the survival of the instrument. Does that make sense? I'll say it again. Conservation is procedures that slow down the process of degradation that naturally takes place over time in order to ensure the survival of the instrument. Conservation may, as a piano technician, one of the first things I learned is the importance of observing carefully, thoroughly, and patiently with time and assessing the instrument at a distance. Because a distance tells you a lot more. You don't walk into an art gallery. If this piano is a piece of art, you don't walk into an art gallery like this. Because you've got no context. Curators and art galleries, in fact, carefully position the artwork so when you walk into that space, you can see at a distance, and then you walk into it to gain the information in the context of that artwork. So, conservation might involve things like interventions, that is repairs, restoration, it could be involving stabilisation of the instrument, minimising interventions and making them detectable, like what we saw Edward Volk and Bill Bradshaw do on the side of the key. Prevention, that is slowing down the process of degradation that naturally occurs over time. For example, limiting access or use of the instrument, or providing appropriate environmental conditions like Alphonse Hopper did, or focusing on preventative measures of an instrument's cultural significance and communication. Watson goes on to say that it could be the instrument might store historical integrity, structural integrity, aesthetic integrity, or conceptual integrity. Restoration, we all know what restoration is. But restoration is actually a very modern thing. We don't think of it, but it's actually a relatively contemporary idea to restore something. Robert Barclay, this man says, because of its origin in the craft tradition, restoration was initially non-contextual. As a practice of restoration, musical instruments have developed from the craft tradition of general repair and maintenance, and carried with a low emphasis of writing anything down. Again, I'm just going to fast forward. Watson goes on to say, heritage mines from history, which is useful, enriching, or entertaining, but it aligns with and elaborates upon for its present purposes. So the piano restorer has to consider a number of things that we have already discussed, but one or two other options can be also considered. Oh wow, there's pages of this. Gee, no wonder I was bored. Okay, so I won't carry on with what we regard as restoration, because I think we will understand that quite well, and I think I've placed the argument of the consequences of restoration hopefully well, which brings me to a conclusion of another option, and it's called what John Watson has invented, the concept or philosophy or principle called restorative conservation. That is, the melding of the returning of an instrument to a known or assumed past state. Now that's the other thing that we've got to be mindful of. For example, like the Botryte intervention. We don't know its original state. We can only assume what in a past state was. So restorative conservation is the returning of an instrument to a known or assumed past state with deference to the instrument's original design. In other words, not going to try and make a Steinway a Kawai or a Kawai something else. Instruments are original design and sonic aesthetic, with processes, this is the conservation bit, that slow down the processes of degradation that naturally takes place over time. So it's an amalgamation of two concepts. So as piano technicians, how do we actually achieve this? And again, Watson gives us some great insights in the principles of what restorative conservation is. For example, in his article he talks about a Steinway built in the early 1900s, restored by a technician in America. And what I was taught, that is, if you're going to restore a piano, you restore that part or component or material from note 1 to note 88. So it's all consistent, aesthetically appealing and even. John Watson's arguing, why do that? If it's a historical instrument, there's only 3 hammers worn out, replace the 3 hammers. Now this is obscene in the way that I've been taught. But his point is, as an information artifact, or document information, if you keep most of the original instrument with the instrument, it goes on to the next generation as a story that can continue to be researched. If you take everything off and replace it, that artifact or that material is now lost. As careful as you might be to store it somewhere, inevitably it will be lost. So Watson creates a very controversial argument that we piano technicians would find somewhat offensive, that you only replace what's necessary and leave as much as the original as you possibly can. That's the principle of restorative conservation. Quickly, of course, there is another option, that is to replicate the instrument. In other words, not restore it, but actually copy it. As a faithful representative, like you see here in Berlin, so in front of you you've got Bach's harpsichord, behind you've got an assortment of replicas that's made by all sorts of different makers. So, in summary, conventional restoration, that is returning an instrument to a known and assumed past state, or restorative conservation, that is preserving as much as you can the historical evidence housed or stored in that instrument. So the connection of these two things, as piano technicians, we can now consider finding ways of both appeasing the historian, that is, I want to keep the piano as original as possible, and the argument of the owner or the player or the museum director who wants it returned to a functional state. And this is a way that we can meet in the middle. I'm going to quickly just go through the next slides without going into much detail. But the principles of restorative conservation are as follows. As I said, careful assessment of the instrument before you make any decisions. Using comparative data. In other words, if you find yourself in front of an instrument that you've never heard of before or seen, what do you do if you don't know how to compare it? There's a lot of documentation now out there that do help you along that way. For example, the Frederick Beck, the piano we think is the First Fleet piano, is pictured here. This is when it was sent to England to be restored by the restorative conservator Lucy Code in Bath, UK, who's an expert in the English piano restoration. And you notice it looks reasonably okay for a piano that's travelled from England to Australia on the First Fleet and then survived what happened in Sydney Cove, and then for the rest of its life, now leading up to where it's stored in Perth. You notice there's no pedals. So Lucy Coates faced with a decision: if I was to restoratively conserve this piano, what information do I need to gather to find out what I need to do or shouldn't do? When Geoffrey Lancaster wrote about this this piano in his 2-volume tome, which is literally that thick each, about the provenance and story of this piano. He noted at the time it had cabriole legs with a stretch rail at the bottom that you can simply pull out and the legs fold up underneath. That was his argument. That was his entire argument as to why this is the first Philippe piano. It's because it's easy to pack away. It's not a good enough argument though. His second argument was it is the only known type of a square piano that instead of having straight legs attached to a framework that has cabriole folding legs, because it's the only one in the world, it must be the first Philippe piano, was his argument. I can say this because I've now graduated, he's no longer my supervisor and he's not here. So what I had to do as a researcher is now look at, is he right? It's wonderful when you actually get to criticise your own supervisor and say, you weren't right. We don't know where this is, but this is an instrument that was found by John Watson himself for me, that's somewhere in England, somewhere in America. You notice it has pedals. Our, that is the piano here in Australia, has no pedals. They're long gone, and I'll explain tomorrow in my keynote as to why we think that's the case. Minimising interventions and making them detectable, like what we saw Edward Volk and Bill Bradshaw do on the side of the key. Prevention, that is slowing down the process of degradation that naturally occurs over time. For example, limiting access or use of the instrument, or providing appropriate environmental conditions like Alphonse Hobart did, or focusing on preventative measures of an instrument's cultural significance and communication. Watson goes on to say that it could be the instrument might store historical integrity, structural integrity, aesthetic integrity, or conceptual integrity. Restoration, we all know what restoration is. But restoration is actually a very modern thing. We don't think of it, but it's actually a relatively contemporary idea to restore something. Robert Barclay, this man says, because of its origin in the craft tradition, restoration was initially non-contextual. As a practice of restoration, musical instruments have developed from the craft tradition of general repair and maintenance, and carried with a low emphasis of writing anything down. Again, I'm just going to fast forward. Watson goes on to say, heritage mines from history, which is useful, enriching, or entertaining, but it aligns with and elaborates upon for its present purposes. So the piano restorer has to consider a number of things that we have already discussed, but one or two other options can be also considered. Oh wow, there's pages of this. Gee, no wonder I was bored. Okay, so I won't carry on with what we regard as restoration, because I think we will understand that quite well, and I think I've placed the argument of the consequences of restoration hopefully well, which brings me to a conclusion of another option, and it's called what John Watson has invented, the concept or philosophy or principle called restorative conservation. That is, the melding of the returning of an instrument to a known or assumed past state. Now that's the other thing that we've got to be mindful of. For example, like the Botryte intervention. We don't know its original state. We can only assume what in a past state was. So restorative conservation is the returning of an instrument to a known or assumed past state with deference to the instrument's original design. In other words, not going to try and make a Steinway a Kawai or a Kawai something else. Instruments are original design and sonic aesthetic, with processes, this is the conservation bit, that slow down the processes of degradation that naturally takes place over time. So it's an amalgamation of two concepts. So as piano technicians, how do we actually achieve this? And again, Watson gives us some great insights in the principles of what restorative conservation is. For example, In his article, he talks about a Steinway, built in the early 1900s, restored by a technician in America. And what I was taught, that is, if you're going to restore a piano, you restore that part or component or material from note 1 to note 88. So it's all consistent, aesthetically appealing, and even. John Watson's arguing, why do that? If it's a historical instrument, there's only 3 hammers worn out, replace the 3 hammers. Now this is obscene in the way that I've been taught. But his point is, as an information artifact, or document information, if you keep most of the original instrument with the instrument, it goes on to the next generation as a story that can continue to be researched. If you take everything off and replace it, that artifact or that material is now lost. As careful as you might be to store it somewhere, inevitably it will be lost. So Watson creates a very controversial argument that we piano technicians would find somewhat offensive, that you only replace what's necessary and leave as much as the original as you possibly can. That's the principle of restorative conservation. Quickly, of course, there is another option, that is to replicate the instrument. In other words, not restore it, but actually copy it. As a faithful representative, like you see here in Berlin, so in front of you you've got Bach's harpsichord, behind you've got an assortment of replicas that's made by all sorts of different makers. So, in summary, conventional restoration, that is returning an instrument to a known and assumed past state, or restorative conservation, that is preserving as much as you can the historical evidence housed or stored in that instrument. So the connection of these two things, as piano technicians, we can now consider finding ways of both appeasing the historian, that is, I want to keep the piano as original as possible, and the argument of the owner or the player or the museum director who wants it returned to a functional state. And this is a way that we can meet in the middle. I'm going to quickly just go through the next slides without going into much detail. But the principles of restorative conservation are as follows. As I said, careful assessment of the instrument before you make any decisions. Using comparative data. In other words, if you find yourself in front of an instrument that you've never heard of before or seen, what do you do if you don't know how to compare it? There's a lot of documentation now out there that do help you along that way. For example, the Frederick Beck, the piano we think is the First Fleet piano, is pictured here. This is when it was sent to England to be restored by the restorative conservator Lucy Code in Bath, UK, who's an expert in English piano restoration. And you notice it looks reasonably okay for a piano that's travelled from England to Australia on the First Fleet and then survived what happened in Sydney Cove, and then for the rest of its life, now leading up to where it's stored in Perth. You notice there's no pedals. So Lucy Coates faced with a decision: if I was to restoratively conserve this piano, what information do I need to gather to find out what I need to do or shouldn't do? When Geoffrey Lancaster wrote about this piano in his 2-volume tome, which is literally that thick each, about the provenance and story of this piano, he noted at the time it had cabriole legs with a stretch rail at the bottom that you can simply pull out and the legs fold up underneath. That was his argument. That was his entire argument as to why this is the First Fleet piano. It's because it's easy to pack away. It's not a good enough argument though. His second argument was it is the only known type of a square piano that, instead of having straight legs attached to a framework, that has cabriole folding legs. Because it's the only one in the world, it must be the First Fleet piano, was his argument. I can say this because I've now graduated, he's no longer my supervisor and he's not here. So what I had to do as a researcher is now look at, is he right? It's wonderful when you actually get to criticise your own supervisor and say, you weren't right. We don't know where this is, but this is an instrument that was found by John Watson himself for me that somewhere in England, somewhere in America, you notice it has pedals. That is the piano here in Australia, has no pedals. They're long gone, and I'll explain tomorrow in my keynote as to why we think that's the case. Here we have pedals. All of a sudden, Lucy Coe has, unfortunately, just this one photograph, but we now have evidence there was indeed pedals, and it was evident there in the piano itself that the parts of the instrument pedal framework or structure was still there, but now we've got something to fabricate to make pedals. This was found by the author Michael Cole. Also, you see, it's got pedals. So all of a sudden, the comparative data for restorative conservation starts to equip with this library of knowledge that yes, the piano once had pedals. It's also not the only piano in the world that had folding cabriole legs. It's at least 3. If you made 3, there's a good chance he made dozens. Temporal identity. Now, this is a really important one in placing the argument, what do you do when you restore any piano, be it built in the early 20th century even? What is temporal identity? In other words, what information you regarded as significant? Now, as an example, and I don't say do this at home, here's the soundboard of the first lead piano. You can see this is another argument as to why it's the first lead piano you hear tomorrow, because this is a string band giving the gauges of each string. This was unheard of on a soundboard in the late 18th century on an English square piano, because well, if you're in England, you just go to Broadwood or someone who replaces a string for you. So when Beck, this is original, when Beck wrote this on the soundboard, he was telling possibly the ship's surgeon who owned the instrument what string gauge is required. The second thing is typical of an English square piano, which is painful to read if you have a tuning one, is the note identification of what rest pin goes to what note. You know, remember you're tuning it here and the rest pin's all the way over here and you're sitting down and you can't see a damn thing. So that there are a cow of things to tune. But so these were important parts of information. So when Lucy restored this soundboard, in other words, it kept as much as the restorative conservation, in other words, she kept as much as the soundboard as she could, and you'll see tomorrow just how much she had to replace and how much she kept. But the argument I had with her at the time in her workshop was, what do we do with this? It's not original, it's graffiti. Someone sat at the end of the piano, about here, on the other side, and with a compass possibly, described something on it. We don't know what it is. It's a pain in the neck. Now, I think it says ND 1909. The man who trained Lucy Coe, who's an engineer, thought, no, it's not that. If you look at it slightly blurry, it's a naughty 14-year-old boy who likes to do the D&B on, you know, car windows and things like that. So I can't see it. I personally think he's a pervert because I can't see what he means by a naughty 14-year-old boy potentially doing it. Anyway, the point being is temporal identity. Do we actually sand this off? Because we don't want to embrace cultural vandalism, if you like. But guess what? It's now part of the fabric of the instrument. It's part of the story. I could not find any evidence from Elizabeth MacArthur, who owned it, and then on to Bill Bradshaw, who gave it to Stuart Simons, who then gave it to Geoffrey Lancaster, who now gets into Perth. I couldn't find anyone along its trail that had any initials like this. I couldn't. But the good thing about research, if you've actually done it, the good thing about research, and in this case restorative conservation, if you've approached it in such a way, the next person might find out. So in 50 years' time, someone might pick up a bit of research and find out who this person was. Yeah, we might see that as immaterial. But it does capture where the piano was when it happened. So these non-original gouged inked markings are now important, and Lucy left them on the piano. And if you ever come to Perth, you can actually see it and tell me whether it looks like, you know, dick and balls. Okay, say that. The other principle of restorative conservation is trying to maintain then as much as the original piano parts and components possible. I'm going to race through this next bit so we can all go have a Bex and a lie down. Here is again an example that these gentlemen who taught me of what not to do. We wouldn't have done it this way in my time as a trainee in the 70s. If you're restoring a piano, you restore from note 1 to note 88. If you're replacing the checks from note 1 to note 88. Here's an example of what Watson's now set in motion, this principle or philosophy of restorative conservation that we piano technicians can now apply. This is a very famous forte piano housed in the Burnett collection that used to be the Finchcox collection in UK. Now it's made by Rosenberg, one of the greatest forte piano makers in Vienna, but hardly known, nowhere near like Walters or Stein or any of these other great makers. But here, what someone has done is the leather has worn out. It's now down to bare wood. Now the leather on the hammer covering of this instrument is, you know, three nails deep. It's not very deep. So instead of doing what I was taught to do by these gentlemen, and that is replace every hammer covering, he's only replaced the ones that were worn out, and he's left the originals. Now aesthetically it's not very pleasing, but the point being is you can't get leather coverings anymore that was used in the 18th century. It doesn't exist. We don't breed animals the same way to make musical instruments. We are not allowed to tan leather the same way that we tanned leather in the 18th century. It's against the laws. It's just, you know, so unhealthy. So that, as Alphonse Suter said, the sound's gone. So by maintaining as much as the original leather, just like the Liszt piano that I showed in the Kunsthistorics Museum, you've kept that information in that piano. Now, the restorer, as Watson said about the Steinway, could have in fact replaced them all so they look like this, and then put them in a nice little bag and written down what they were from. They would have been lost. Here we have, 100 years later, or possibly 200 years later, that leather is still in the piano. This is another big thing and controversial. Reversibility. I grew up being taught by these gentlemen how to use hot glue. Oh. And it was my job every single morning to light up the glue pot, as Gary did. And then this revolutionary product came to our world called white glue or Aquadeer or whatever it is, and it was less stinky and all sorts of things, and we went on to it. Now we have this stuff called CA glue and other things that you can do for quick restoring. And I've seen evidence of this in an air ride, again, a very famous air ride in England. And in fact, you've got one here in the ANU, exactly the same problem. Where as air ride's planks start to give away, someone has come along with a quick fix, and that is put CA glue in the plank, which has allowed potentially the instrument to be playable because it's tunable with ruined piano. Essentially, the principle of restorative conservation is reversibility. So the instruments that was, for example, the Frederick Beck First Fleet piano that was built in 1780, Lucy Cove was out, pulled to pieces. Edward Bunk, if you go to his website, you can see a Bluthner Grand that he's actually dismantled right down to the last, bit of wood that holds the whole thing together. Because you can. Because the original maker used a reversible glue. If you make a mistake, you can fix it. You can change it. Or in the future, someone can come along and redo it if you've done it wrong, because you didn't have the knowledge or the materials to do it. So if you're the one thing I'd like you all to take away that I had to do like this is when you're approaching a historic instrument, think that someone in the future is going to judge your work. And if you can do it in such a way that even if they did judge their work, and even if you did make a mistake, like Christopher Clark was saying about what happened with the Edwin Book situation, we can at least the next generation come and undo it and start again. So maintaining as much as original as you can and ensuring that whatever you do is reversible. Essentially by the materials that you use, or especially adhesives that you use. Oh, this wrong thing come up again. Lastly, identification of the work you perform makes life a lot easier for the future researcher. Archiving, in other words, maintaining the things that you've taken off the instrument, and most importantly, write what you've done down, so the next person can come along and find out what you did. This is an example of exactly this. This is a man called Georg Sen, who I've met a number of times in Basel in Switzerland, and this is just part of his restoration report, catalogue of every instrument that he's restored, his entire career. And it sits in a box like this. So that means when we go to this instrument, we can go to his restoration report and we can now capture what it was, that is a known or assumed past date. We know what preventative conservation is, essentially how to look after environmental control, things like that. And lastly, a principle of restorative conservation has to include technical conservation. We could keep original information. We could actually write it down in a restoration report. But all these things are in vain if we don't have appropriately trained future technicians to look after it. So part of my philosophy when I wrote my thesis was exactly this. Who is going to look after the First Fleet piano for the next 240 years? So I want to thank you for your patience and you're attentive this afternoon, and rather than carry on, because I've a lot more I could talk about, I'm not. I'm going to open the floor for any questions, and I hope I can answer. But any comments or questions before we knock off for whatever we're knocking off for? And just to give a plug for tomorrow, I'll be talking about, indeed, what could well be Australia's oldest surviving piano. That is the First Fleet piano, a very, very important instrument if it is the First Fleet piano, and has a lot to say other than just the fact it could be the First Fleet piano. This is the instrument, if you're not there tomorrow, this is the instrument that potentially will save, in part, our craft. Because as a result of my PhD teaching program, that's the pedagogy, I identified 4 young technicians in Perth who are all now being trained. One by one, they had to pass how to tune this instrument appropriately to an 18th century temperament with people, 11 participants, none of them who had ever tuned an English square piano before. That sounds like torture, and it was. Point being is, they only had 12 lessons of an hour and a half each to do it. Why? Because, well, we know in the 18th century they only had 3 months in a boat journey to learn how to do it. So it can be, what I can say as a result of my experiment, it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. So this is a very important instrument, other than the fact that a university that wants to brag that it could be the First Fleet piano. It is contentious in itself. But for me, it's the instrument that has opened a narrative of what cultural significance means. It opens a narrative of also very controversial subjects. If it's the First Fleet piano with colonialism in the way it is today, it's not a very sexy subject. In fact, the university who funded it has now walked away from the title completely because it's now so awkward. But for me, the instrument told me a lot about what's happened to it in the last 240 years that I'll divulge tomorrow. For me, it's an educational tool. We had to make some serious decisions when Lucy and I first assessed this piano in England. One, do we replace all the key coverings? And you can see how badly scalloped and damaged the ivory front plates are. Some of them were not original and some of them were missing. So the first question, if we're in Paris, for example, you wouldn't be able to replace them. You'd have to remove them by law. We have very strict CITES agreements now, and we had to argue a point that is the instrument left England to be restored or restored at the consort with ivory on it, and had to come back with ivory on it. My argument is this, because there's a woman
who's arguing a very strong point about past colonialism and how to actually dust our boots of this whole stuff, to the point and extreme, I'm getting off track now, but the point of extreme that she wants to have the original manuscript that Handel's Messiah that's housed in the Royal Academy destroyed. Because Handel profited as a shareholder from the company that used slave labour to get materials out of Africa. So, guilt by association, all these generations later, we're going to destroy it. Now, I don't believe this is the right thing to do at all. But also, I don't believe that we should ever have killed an elephant for our own hedonistic, physical sensation and pleasure of playing a keyboard. But we did. But if I got Lucy to remove all this and replace it with plastic or celluloid or whatever I'm talking about, that information is not only gone, we don't know. For example, you can see how scalloped that E is, that A is, that C is, that E is, that A, G is. We know they are generally the keys that they played. Remember, it's a domestic instrument, so they're playing simple domestic instruments. Would have played God Save the King every single day on that journey to Sydney. My argument is we leave it there because it means that the one thing that we as human beings unfortunately do is repeat the evils of the past. And if we don't have ivory to show, this is what we did. We don't agree with it. We shouldn't have never done it, but there it is. That means in 100 years' time, a young person can see this is what it is. This has baleen springs. Now I've got to, without going into what I'm talking about tomorrow, every single mahogany part that was used to replace, every bit of ivory and every bit of baleen was salvaged or used from another salvaged instrument. So nothing was harmed to restore this instrument. But it leaves a legacy of information and knowledge and hopefully future skills. Thank you very much for your attention. Is there any questions? I hope not, because that means I have to try and answer them. But anyway, no, do you have any questions?
You did replace the pedals?
We did replace the pedals because we know that it did have pedals. And tomorrow I'll explain why possibly they were taken off and what we did to make sure that the pedals were replaced. So that is in fact the piano. So that is the Frederick Beck, possibly the first lead piano.
So another question. So, do we get to hear how it sounds?
Absolutely. When the university lets me show people.
No, as in, do you have a recording that you can actually...
I'm not allowed to. So political, hot potato is this piano now, that I'm not allowed to show it off. I'm not allowed to have people play it or hear it. I'm not even supposed to be here talking about the title First Lead Piano. I wasn't allowed to call my thesis, the rest of it, the restorative conservation of the First Lead Piano, because it's such a hot potato since the Black Lives Matter movement and colonialism movement. Secondly, it's a beacon for cultural vandalism that we're now seeing all around the world. And in Western Australia, someone got into the art gallery in Western Australia and spray painted the original McCubbin. Fortunately, didn't damage it because it's coated, just like they tried to do in the Louvre. This instrument's not only got solid mahogany, this instrument's got ivory, it's got ebony, it's got baleen. It screams cultural vandalism. And so if I was allowed to be put into a public arena, guess what's going to happen possibly to it? It will be used as a political statement. And what I'm trying to do is change the narrative of the instrument away from the First Lead Piano to the story of this instrument and how it survived all the way through from 1780 to today, and how it potentially will ensure the survival of our craft into the future. Any other questions?
Is there a point where perhaps there's been a past repair done to the instrument and that repair is worth preserving as part of the history?
That's where I could have gone further what temporal identity means. So like the Bockwright Zomper situation, every stage of repair or restoration adds a layer of information. And at some stage, we, the piano technician, has to decide what layer do we go back. And if we go back to a known or assumed past state, we don't know what that is. Original sound's gone. Or, like the graffiti on the soundboard, it's an important part of the fabric of storing information into the future. So this is where, for us as technicians, when we're faced with either a modern historical piano or pre-1880 historical keyboard instrument, to be well informed, and you can now be well informed. John Watson, a fellow piano technician, freely offers his research and his paper on the PDG. Ken Watson, Ed Sheep does the same thing. This man can inform us. There's a stack of YouTube videos from Edwin Book. The post-early music revival has done two things. One, it incited the want to actually hear authentic instruments being played or heard again, with the consequence that we discussed. And two, exactly this conversation, exactly that question. Any other questions?
Yes. Sorry. Here you go.
If you're undertaking pedagogy, are you open to any questions from members who are doing up old pianos like this?
Sure.
Right.
Absolutely. So hunt me down and I'm happy to help in any way, if I can, or assist you with a connection of people within the international community who will. We've now formed, with all my research and my travelling around the world, I've now formed very close associations and relationships with eminent people in this area to ensure that we don't make the mistakes that we did from 1960, 1970. So hopefully we can actually look back with pride that what we've done is at least reversible, and we've identified what we've done, and we've kept as much of the original we can. Gary? Sorry.
Well, just a very quick question. In reference to your collection, are you going to house it into a museum? Has there been something established to preserve your collections?
I wish I could answer that. The original plan for the $1 billion building, the ECU building in Perth, the centre of Perth, was exactly for that purpose. Yeah. Unfortunately, during COVID and political issues, we now have space to house 18. So I met with the governor and public officials only last week to discuss what else can we do with these instruments so they're not literally thrown away, taken to the tip, or sent off to China. What can we do? So unfortunately, I can't answer yet that question, but watch the space. Gary?
My question was, and I'm sure we're all in the same situation, where I've had a barrel piano in a country area that was in a museum, and they said, can you just get it playable for us? And the CA who did the job brilliantly. And I'd tune it every year, and it sounds wonderful. And the people go through the museum, and the guy plays it every day. If this piano gets played and gets enjoyed as this 18th century, whatever it is, barrel piano. And for me to then say, no, I can't touch this instrument, is a travesty.
It is. And this raises, in conclusion, because we're now going to go have whatever we're doing, Gary, I've seen the instrument that Gary restored, and I've got to say he's actually honoured exactly what needed to be done. Who owned the piano? It was the client's decision to have it restored and make it playable. Gary has just honoured what the client wanted. Yes, by using C8 glue, it's not reversible, so it's a counter to this entire argument. But if you remember what I go back to at the beginning, is I'm not being dogmatic. Each situation has to be looked at in its own context. And in the context of this argument for Gary of the barrel piano, look at the joy and significance this instrument now has every time it's played. Is that more important? Or is it more important that in 300 years' time someone can research the original state of the instrument? Personally, I actually fall on Gary's side in this situation. It needs to be played. It needs to be heard. If we can encourage one listener, one young listener, to go into the mystery and wonders of what music can represent in the world, that's why we're here. That's why these guys sell their wares. And what Gary has done, sure, doesn't appease the argument of restorative conservation, but the philosophy runs deeper and more significant. Any other questions before we go? Excellent. If you have anything else to ask me, I'll be sleeping in the corner, having another nervous breakdown. But thank you very much for your time.
Well done.
In the main room. Yeah.